All right, welcome everyone. This is Seth Dellinger, and this is the Embodied Dialogue podcast. And I'm very honored to have Clayton Nyakana with me as my guest today. So, welcome, Clayton.
Thanks, Tess. So glad to be here. I'm glad to have made your acquaintance and to connect and to even be here to have this conversation. Yeah, it was
Yeah,
great.
absolutely. And before we started, we were just sort of referring to the place where we met, which sometimes is known as the liminal web. But already, if audience members don't know what that means, it just sort of means podcasts like this one or online spaces where we meet. Um, but you're in Brisbane, Australia, but maybe you could kind of give some of the backstory because that's not where you're originally from. And then maybe you could give whatever information you want about your background, and then maybe also include how you got into this space where we met, this liminal web space, and what you think is important about it.
Great. Thanks, Seth. Yeah, so my name's Clayton Nyakana. I'm originally from Uganda, uh, and now I moved to Brisbane, so that's where I live now with my family. Um, Yeah, I have a beautiful family of two young ones, like a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old, and uh, I work in tech that's my day job, but also uh, in my own personal exploration, I started this little place that I call lived quality. Like I've always been curious about how you can live a good life. And so I started to explore that theme and do my own research and started to discover different lessons along that rabbit hole. And so I publish some articles on livequality.com, which also has a Substack. Um, and I also do some podcasting with that, where I'll sort of like host people and we'll sort of try to find out their own lived quality. Like, what is that wisdom that's powering their life? Um, yeah, and so that's mostly my work that I do. And yeah, we did meet in the liminal web. I am a big fan of John Vervaeke's work, um, and and all the other contributors of liminal web, of course. Um, but yeah, it's like this whole and trying to understand the virtues and transcendence and transformation and uh, how to incorporate all these tools in your day to day in such a way that you can actually apply them. Because I also have a background in I did a lot of science in school. And so like I've always been oriented in thinking in an experimental way. Like I like to test stuff. Like you watch something online and somebody, explains, oh, if you follow these steps and do this way, it's gonna produce this result. So I would like to test it out and see that does it actually lead to a result? And yeah, and so uh, that is, you'd say, me in a nutshell.
Beautiful. Well, just to draw you out a little bit more, you mentioned John Vervaeke, so he's a cognitive scientist and cognitive psychologist, and probably best known for 50 lectures that he put out on YouTube called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And this is not to say that we should review his work. It's been reviewed quite a bit, but the title suggests, that we're living in a time where the world is kind of in crisis. And one of the things that he proposes is that people get involved with what he calls ecologies of practice, that basically we begin to work on how we show up in the world. And an ecology of practice suggests that we actually have many different ways of doing that. And so I imagine that's part of what you're talking about with lived quality. I really like that phrase because and I told you I was reading one of the articles on your Substack called Legacy Oriented Work. So I'm sort of drawing on that article as well. Maybe we'll definitely put, information for your content with this video. But you kind of talk about how each one of us has a unique wisdom. And also in that phrase, lived quality, you talk about participation. So it's wisdom isn't just something I've accumulated in my mind, but it's how I'm living day to day. Um, so anyway, I'd love to hear you talk about that more. And also, if you want, you've said that you work in tech, and then you also do uh, writing and podcasting. But as I understand it, there's a vision of something that you would also like to unfold through this work. So if you want to point us towards that as well, that would be great.
Yes. Yeah. So I came up, across this whole. We'll actually dive it into how I came into it. Like I had sort of a crisis of sorts, right? Like because we had just moved countries and living in a new place, and you get to a sense of like, okay, so if anybody doesn't really know, like migrating from, let's say, a low income city to a high income city comes with a huge difference in lifestyle, right? And if you're coming from different parts of the world, it's gonna come with a different culture and different ways of being and everything.
Right.
And so, yeah,
And
where I come
just by the
from,
way, when did you move? I just want to get a sense of the timeline.
yeah, so this was like back in 2016, right?
Okay, so
We got, yeah,
you've
yeah,
been
we
in
got,
Australia for 8 years
yeah,
now.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so you're
And
talking
so,
about what this transition is like. Uh,
yes,
yeah.
yeah. And so it all started with that transition. And so, so we got this opportunity to move through work. Like I was working for this company, and uh, they decided they couldn't run their business like in Kampala anymore. And so they had some options of like, oh, look, you could move to these other locations that we continue to run a business and work there in consulting, or you just take a redundancy package. But I was like, oh, if you're gonna facilitate like a relocation, we can treat it like a holiday, right? Let's let's go on this adventure, see what happens, right? And so we pack up our bags and eventually we end up in Brisbane, right? In Brisbane, Australia, because, well, it wasn't America and it also did not snow there. Those were our two big
You didn't
criteria.
want to go to America and you didn't want to go anywhere where it snowed. Got it.
Yeah, it was like, like if it doesn't snow and it's not America, it's like my criteria was like I don't want to move to America to raise a family. After all the things we had had that's happening to people who look like us who moved to
Uh-huh.
America,
Uh-huh.
and so we're gonna like maybe I was strongly opposed to that. And for my wife, she we grew up in a tropical area, right? So it's like living in the cold, I don't know what that's like. I do not want to get myself anywhere close to that. So if there is no snow and cold, it's fine. And so that's how we end up here, because it's sort of like it doesn't snow here and it's also not America.
I love
But
that. It's like I'm ready to step outside of my comfort zone, but only so much. I don't want to be,
yes,
I don't want to throw myself into just total chaos. Yeah,
yeah,
great.
yeah. Yeah, but anyhow, so we move here and it's sort of like all the ideas we'd had about like all people who had sort of like moved uh, to a first world country. That's how we called it at the time. It's like, oh, we're moving to first world country. What's the life like? Oh, you're gonna stick out like a sore thumb because there won't be many people who look like you. But other than that, you get there's more opportunities, you make a bit more money, and life is a bit more organized, and all the benefits that come with, living in a a big place where you can just hide in there and just live life with much more resources. And so
Hmm.
my assumption, having been raised in my tradition, is like, oh, you have to get in a position where you can better provide for your family as a man. And so I felt like, yes, I think I have checked that box. I have achieved that objective. And so the expectation is like, look, we live in a more secure environment. Uh, we have more access to funds and we have greater opportunity. Therefore, we have more to eat. We can eat anything, right? It's like, so you've sorted out the finances challenge. You've sorted out the food challenge. So you should therefore have a good life, right? Um, Year one, yes, it felt like that because you're exploring and all of that. It was a bit tricky with the food because it didn't fit what we have defined as food. Like our thing that we call food was not the thing they called food here. It was a bit different. Like our food is more savory, it has more stews in it, more starchy. These people's food was sweet. Right? It
So
was
you,
sweet. It was lots of meat.
mhm.
Uh, you know, getting the ingredients that you needed to make the meal that you were used to was really hard. They didn't sell those vegetables that we were used to. And also, when you bought what you saw and you went home and made it, it didn't taste the way it used to taste back home. Like it was less flavorful. Because like back home in Uganda, the food is very organic, and you just like you grow gardens, like big gardens, and you can just eat something from the garden, and it tastes amazing, like without even cooking it. And then you can just take it and then just steam it, and then eat it that way. Just a little bit of salt, and that's all you have. That's all the seasoning you would do. I just add a bit of salt to something, and it's great. But over here, we wondered what's with all the spices, and eventually we started to catch and it's like, oh yeah, the food is not that flavorful. You have to like really add flavor to it, with all these spices and cook it a certain way. Like you can find the more flavorful, tasty food, which is like organic, but it's quite pricey. You
Right,
can't like, yeah,
right,
you can't buy
right.
that stuff. Like the more affordable stuff, yeah.
Yeah. So as I listen to you talk about just figuring out the situation with food and how it was different and how you had to adjust for it, I also remember that one of the things you heard before you came to Australia was you're going to stick out like a sore thumb. And of course, immigration and different flows of population around the world, there are, diaspora communities in different places. But I wonder, I mean, do you know other people from Uganda who are in Brisbane, or did you know any in the beginning? When you connected with them, was there an opportunity to, find a little of what was typically missing? Anyway, not to take you away from where you were at, but I think this is really actually, yeah, this is a really valuable just thing for us to think about is that process of encountering the other, right? And making some accommodations, but also not giving up who you are in the process.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there were people we had moved with as well,
Okay.
because it was like a workplace opportunity. So a bunch of us moved here, and so we connected. So we were not like by ourselves. So there were these are other about like four or five other families with whom we found ourselves in this scenario, and
Mhm.
so we connected because by circumstance, of course, and some good friendships emerged out of that.
Mhm.
But also we started to meet other people who had moved here, other Ugandans, and so they started to show us the ropes. there's a budding community in Queensland. It's called Ugandans in Queensland. In Australia, we just name things the way they are.
Right.
Like,
Right.
don't make up something new. So, like, I live in an area called Mango Hill, and there's literally a hill with mango trees on it, and that's
Wow.
what it's named after.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. So you had
Yeah.
some people you could ground with where it was familiar, but then you were also tasting the sweet food, and obviously, I assume you're meeting a lot of Australians. So what was the response, or how were you welcomed, or did you ever feel that you were not being welcomed? What was that all
That
that
was
whole
very,
process
it was very welcoming. Australians are very uh, beautiful people. Like they are very curious, very open, very kind.
like?
Uh, in some ways, it's shocking. It's like it's like, wow, they're just really nice, but they're also very reserved. So it's weird in that sense. It's like um, there's a saying in Australia that a good neighbor is the one you don't hear from. And sort of like it's a weird thing because like where we come from, your neighbor was in your business. Like they wanted to know you, they want to see how they can help you. They're always checking on you. But over here, the your neighbor is giving you as much distance as possible. And eventually I made sense of it. It's like, oh, they're just trying to create space for you to be whichever way you want because I guess one of the underlying assumptions like, your home is like your sanctuary, and so they shouldn't interfere with anything to do with that, and they should be very respectful of that. So it's coming from a place of uh, kindness and respect, and it's like if you need anything, you can just come over and ask. But we're just gonna stand over here and let
Right.
you
Right.
be you. Yeah.
But I imagine that's also a different concept than how you would describe good neighbors. Because when I asked you how much time you had to talk today, you told me that later in order to be a good neighbor, that you're going to be visiting, someone in your neighborhood and helping out. They're doing some work on their porch or something like that. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a very different concept. For us, it's like we're very much tribal society. That's how it's sort of like we live much as a collective. Like uh, what's that saying? I've seen it in war movies. It's like we leave no man behind type thing. And so it's like if I know you, Seth, and you're now in my tribe, like you're you're my responsibility and I'm your responsibility. It's like we have this loyalty program we both subscribe to, and we have to help each other,
right,
uh, irrespective of whether you think you want it or you want it. You're gonna get the help,
right,
and so it's sort of like that's part of the culture. And it was a very different culture here when we moved. Yeah.
right. So we have sweet or savory food. We have two different ways of, being good neighbors. But what I'm already noticing, and I'm projecting a little bit because we got to speak once before and got to know you a little bit, and I know some of where this is going. I'm just appreciating how you're pointing to the differences, but I don't hear any sense of one is better than the other. It's
Mhm.
like, this was the experience in Uganda, and then this is the experience in Australia. And yeah, it sounds to me like an expansion of experience rather than again, one being better than the other. Of course, we all have preferences, this is
Yeah.
fine, but it just seems like the kind of feeling I get with you is an orientation of curiosity to
Mm.
expanding the possibilities.
Yeah, yeah, and I've always been that way. Like I always just get curious about things that I don't really know because I'm like, okay, interesting. Like, let's
Mhm,
see, let's go down that rabbit hole and see what we discover.
mhm,
But in the moment, of course, it made feel like, that is odd. I wouldn't do that.
mhm.
But
Right,
then the next thing would be like, but why are they doing it that way? I wanna see. And funny enough, like over time, I have come to discover that Actually, you could almost find virtue in anything. Like almost everything has like some virtue driving it, and it's trying to aim for a good.
Mm,
And
mm.
it may get corrupted, like in the interpretation or maybe the way it's being implemented. But if you like really dig deep to the origin, it's
Yeah.
like what was the intent here? Like the intent is always pointing to a certain good, and you're like, oh, so it started out pointing to a good, and then it got corrupted in this way, and then it's like, okay, then we ended up this side. Or something was aiming for a good and it was successful and managed to get there.
Hmm.
But so since then, it's been like, okay, we need to just appreciate the differences and
Hmm.
treat them the way they are. Um, yeah, so that's sort of like that's where that thinking sort of came from. But in the process of, adjusting and all that, one day I come back home from work and we're sitting at home and it's gloomy. Like there was nothing, there was no valid reason for the gloom, or at least one that I was aware of.
Mm,
And my son, he was, I think, around 2 at the time, and he's running around and he knocks something over, and I get so enraged, and I think I hit him or something. But then I was in disbelief. Like, what did I just do? So I quickly pick him up and I'm holding him and I'm soothing him. But as I'm doing that, I'm going through this weird dilemma. One is like, wait, uh, I love this child, and what did I just do to them? That doesn't feel right. Like I deeply care about them. Why did I do something that would harm them?
mm,
And that sort of like dropped into, oh wait, yeah, but also I'm looking at my wife. She doesn't look like a very happy person. It's like we're supposed to be happy, right? Like we got all this, we're living in this place which seems to be better and we have access to more things. Why do we feel this way? Why does it not feel like what it looks?
mm,
And so that sort of like drew me down that rabbit hole. I was like, I gotta find out, like, why, why does it not feel the way it looks, right? And so I started then to investigate that and going down all those rabbit holes. This is around about like 2018. So trying to question, is it like the different religious practice here? Because like we're also very religious where we come from. And it's very actually, now that I think about it, like it's very deeply engaging. Like the participation is so strong, and the participation sort of like just sucks you into what you should do and directs you. But over here, the participation was very, you'd say it doesn't suck you in. You have so much room to author how you participate, if I may call it that way. Like you have lots of leverage. You have a lot of choice. You can say no to doing certain things. You can choose to customize how you do certain things and how you should participate in all situations was not given to you by the situation. Like it didn't feel like the situation is forcing you to participate a certain way. Uh, but the culture we're used to is more like the situation always told you how you should engage. So you didn't really need to think about that or prepare, or you all you had to do is just show up, and then everything that's happening around you and the people who are there would help you adjust and know how to engage with whatever was going on. And so that was very different here because we had sort of like you had to figure out everything. It's like, hey Seth, what do you guys have uh, for bread? It's like, oh, we like this kind of like salty, nutty bread, right? And they're like, oh, that's different. Like where we're from, there's only like two kinds of bread. There's like salty bread and sweet bread. It's like, why can't you guys just have two options? And then you're at the grocery store and there's like 17 kinds of bread. And you have to pick one. It's like, oh my God. Because then when you have less options, you always know what's best. Like knowing
Right,
what the best option is very easy. But when there's like
right. It's
17
like,
options to select through, it's like which one? I have to do a thesis on each of them.
yeah. So you went from a place where these kinds of choices were pretty defined. There was a sense of stability in that. And then, Westerners like to maybe celebrate choice, but it's also like you're encountering all this ambiguity and like kind of less stability. It's not clear. Oh, I do it my way, but do whatever you want. And then it's like I can also imagine it's like, well, how am I going to feel connected with you if you do whatever you want and I do whatever I want? Um,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah,
It's like we gotta be doing the same thing. We can't everybody can't just do their own thing, right? Because like part of what makes us connected is doing the same thing together. It's like it's sort of like a way of knowing each other. But through that, you'd say pre-selected set of things. And so it started to become like you had to build it like most of the catch-ups would have, like, visiting each other as friends when we had just moved. The conversations, I guess even up to today, it's still around those differences, like, oh, we have to do this. Oh, our children have grown and they're at this point, and now we have to make all these choices that uh we know, like one of the interesting things, like, oh, so now that we live here, like when we'd go back home to visit, um, like our parents and our elder, aunts and uncles, one of the things they would caution us about, like, oh, you have to be very careful. Uh, we had things over there, like your child could now become something strange. And it's like how it's like, well, like how here, like back home, how it's just you're either male or female, and that's it. Yeah, in the West, it's different. You can't just be only those two options. You could become something that we don't know. And I'm going like, yes, I completely understand what you're pointing at there. And it's a real dilemma because like we don't know how we've not been raised to know how to deal with those differences.
right,
And yeah, even when we get encountered by someone who is not falling in the, you'd say, in the standard definition,
right.
we always have to reorient and go like, okay, so what do we do in this situation? And slowly, like I was saying, Australia is a very beautiful place. Like everyone comes at it with kindness and comedy in some sort of ways. Like we play with it, and slowly we're learning. But it's very, this is not what we were brought up on, and so there's a lot of learning. Yeah.
Yeah, and it sounds like you know, gender identity is a really good example of something that you could sort of say, okay, well, there's a really stable definition, or it's whatever you want. Um, and you could make an argument for why either of those positions, I don't know, I don't even know what word to say, but people, people argue for both of those ways of seeing it. But what you're explicitly talking about is sort of being in contact with both of these ways of seeing the world. And, when you raise your children, there's definitely no blueprint for how to raise a Ugandan in Australia. Like maybe you talk to your Ugandan friends in Australia, but it's like at every step of the way, it's like there's two options. Should we, do what we've always known, but it is actually not reflected in the immediate landscape? Or should we do what people here do, even though this is not where we're from? Um, yeah. So,
Yeah, and how do you find a happy middle? Yeah.
right. And so I'm still interested too in this moment that you described, this gloomy day seemed to be when like a deeper inquiry began for you. And I imagine, so this was one piece of it, is it, like, and we've talked about food, we've talked about, a little bit about gender here, but I imagine in every imaginable way, you're encountering at least two different ways of doing things, and then being confronted with there's actually no one to tell me. It's like it's up to me to carve my own path.
Yes, and that you touch on, there is no one to tell me, was was a huge point of transition for us. Like, because back home there was always someone to tell you, right? It's like for something you didn't know, you'd ask your parents or your siblings. You'd crowdsource the answer, and it would be there. Like, if you didn't know what you're dealing with, there would be a way of finding out that was quick and easy. But over here, it was not like that at all. And also, uh, we started to quickly realize the how like our difference wasn't mainly accounted for in this culture setup. It's like, oh yeah, like all the options they have, and nothing we've ever seen before, or something that we want, let's say, right? It's like, oh, okay. Like for to give you an example, like we were having fights with my wife, and all couples have that. Like this is a natural part of relationship. But at the time, like I had a few friends who are going through like divorces. And so that gave me an idea. I was like, oh, maybe I should think about that. But then it felt like a strange idea because I'm like, no, no, we don't do that. Like we try and resolve whatever is the problem and try to get the bottom of it. But then now I had this new other idea. It's like, oh, maybe we could just get divorced, right? Like, how about that? It's like, why not try that out? And it's like, no, it doesn't feel right. And so like thankfully like I was able to sort of like introspect about it and like really think about it and not just jump to a conclusion, but that was an option I could have just taken because we're having a bad season, right? and
Yeah.
and so it, it's it was very challenging, but partly because there was no one to ask. And like in African, you'd say societies, most of them at least, like where I was raised, this is the situation where you would go to someone older than you, like your parents or your grandparents, and you would present because they have more life experience, so they would be in a position to understand what you're going through at this point in life because they've been there, and then they would give you like they would play the sage. They would then now tell you, well, when I lived in that time and I had that kind of problem, here are a few things that I tried, and here's what like our tradition has always recommended you do, and here's some options. Choose from that. They're well researched.
Hmm.
Uh, but over here, like you would get this whole the question, and it became like a very at some point an annoying question. It's like, what do you want? What
Mm.
do you mean? What do I want? It's like, am I supposed to know what I want in this kind of scenario? I did not even think I was going to be in this situation. It's like, how should I know what I want in this situation?
So it
Uh,
sounds like what you actually did want was someone to tell you what to do at that point. Um, and the idea of someone saying, it's up to you wasn't necessarily a welcome suggestion, right?
Not
And
at
I can
all. It was
imagine,
just,
the opposite, someone like the way I grew up, I probably would have been like, well, how dare you tell me what to do? Like I will decide for
oh.
myself exactly.
No, I'll be kind of like, yeah, 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 yeah. Please tell me. Please tell me.
And
I
well,
don't want to
you
have to
never
deal
know.
with this.
I'm divorced, so
It's interesting though. Like it's like the more I think about it, the more I try to understand it. Like like we said before, like there is no right or wrong. It's just a way. It's just an approach,
hmm.
and and that was very strange to deal with. Like when I was going through, like some of these people's works, like the thing that sort of started to stick out, like there is a big emphasis on the person, right? Like in the West, like there's a this underlying assumption that you as a an individual, uh, an agent, and you really know what you're after, and you can go for it. And in some ways, yes, like I agree with that, but also in some ways, I kind of feel like not always, not all the time. It's like you can't just be an individual. It's like,
Right.
yeah, you're buried within a set of other individuals, and there is powers to both. I think you have to do both. Like there's a need for like that in between spot where you're both an individual and embedded into a group of individuals that are doing something similar. At least that's sort of like where I'm getting to now. But at the time, like all this was sort of like in the air. It's like, oh my God, what do I do with this? How do I deal with this? It's so, and there is so much. There's so many things. Then all of a sudden, it's like, oh, I still have to maintain this, but then I have now to solve these, uh, psychological problems. It's like, oh my God. And and so you figure out a solution. And so my solution was like, I'm just gonna learn more. I'm gonna try to understand how it all works, and let's see where we go. And so that's how I went onto that trend that sort of like eventually led me into the liminal space and all these, meditative practices, all these wisdom things that normally I don't think like growing up were I was exposed to at all. They were kind of like things you've heard of, but they're weird things because you don't do that. Like you have life to deal with. This is stuff that people who have a lot of time on their hands usually do, and they're probably not busy dealing with like real life. And
Mhm.
but I found myself like, oh wait, now I have to make time for that. I have to start reading more of these works, trying to understand uh, what is it because like what is good, what is love, what is caring, because I went down I remember having lots of coffees with their friends, like asking them, like I find myself stuck at this point whereby I'm even questioning what love is, because like I have this idea that I love my child and I love my partner, but I don't know. Is it by circumstance that I have to love them? Because like we just happen to, they happen to be my child and she happens to be my partner. Because, like questioning the basics, just trying to understand what does that really mean. And so in the process of that though, like I get to a place where I discovered that, oh, those definitions have been given to me. It's like, but that was just the starting point. Like that was the vanilla framework on which I needed to build my own version. And so now I had to kind of like start to redefine these things. I was like, oh, uh, something like I'll give you a funny example. Like someone would you'd meet a stranger and they would say they love you. Like in the West, that is weird. It's like the follow-up thing would be like, you don't even know me. Like,
Right.
what are you subscribing to here? You have no clue what you're about to subscribe to.
Hmm.
But for us, like where we come from, that is that's a positive intent. It's like, oh, they don't mean they love you right now, but they're coming at you with an orientation of loving you. Like their intent is to love you.
Right.
So uh they're willing to do whatever they need to do to bear you to a point where you're lovable for them. Like that's what we mean when we say when
Right.
somebody will express a loving, to you before they know you. It's more like, oh, in the future we're gonna be in a situation where you're lovable for me. So, um, and if I start now, if I start assuming that we've got into that future, we can get there. But
Right.
in the West, it's kind of like, no, 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 you gotta go through the terms and conditions and make it very clear and very definite what you're agreeing to, what you're accepting. And So you know how to get out of it.
Mm. You come from Uganda, you come to Australia, and you just find basic things like food, and how people live together are big questions. Then you come to this moment of feeling like a kind of a strange feeling of maybe conflict or something that's not harmonious right there with your own family. And you're in the midst of trying to understand how could that happen? How can I make it better? And it sounds like what eventually starts to happen is like the existential questions or the things that the philosophers discuss. And even with this, it's like, what's love? Well, these people say it's this, and these people say it's that. And again, it's like there's actually no one who can guarantee the definition for me. I have to. So it sounds like now you're deliberate, but you've sort of recognized I want to understand how it all works. The scope of inquiry has become very wide, and at some point you also found these spaces online where these kinds of questions are being asked, and of course, online takes us beyond our local geography. It takes us out into an potentially anyway international discourse. I know that you and I have seen each other at the Net, which Daniel Garner hosts along with Michelle Garner, the OG Rose team. And there's people from different parts of the world who show up there. But I don't know if that was your starting point, but it's you're now kind of like connecting with other people who are asking these questions too. Is that fair to say?
Yes, yes. So I'm connecting with people. I'm reading lots of works, and then you know, Viveki blesses us with his 50
Mm,
uh, part series. I remember going through that, and it really struck me. It's like he talks about there's a part in there about domicide, like and how exile was the worst kind of punishment someone would get, and then I was like, oh. That's interesting. We thought like that's an opportunity in this in our current class, like being able to move to a different place. That is a great opportunity because then you can start over. You get different circumstances. But then in the past, it was looked at as no, 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 no. You never get out of your commune because that's a big part of who you are. And so going through that series, sort of like for me, like it really, really was very helpful to make sense of the differences and
mm,
that whole transition that was going on. And in the process, like I think one big thing it did for me was to put me in a place whereby, like, okay, what I'm experiencing is not uh is not strange. I'm not ill. Right? This is uh this is normal progression because of the experiences that I've had and the scenarios I've been through. And so if that happened to anyone, they would probably go through the same thing. And so
mm,
now uh here are some suggestions of things I should do. And one big takeaway was I had to, let's say, rebuild the missing parts of my culture that I sort of like used to lean on. That was just a given, like, the little rituals, the little traditions we had, like those are always just given to you. But now, when I found myself as, like a Ugandan Australian, like in between, it meant that, well, that category has not been those traditions and cultures have not been defined, and so it's like, okay, you gotta define your own. And so it's like life sort of became like a DIY project.
mm,
And yeah, but it was now more intentional. At least I knew what I was dealing with. And
mm,
so now I became more intentional about it. It's like, oh, okay, so we may not get like the big, let's say, communal thing that was always happening. Like in Uganda, for example, every weekend there's lots of weddings you have to go and attend. So there's all these big parties. It's like, yeah, you're gonna have to do your own parties or seek them out or find a way of recreating the communal party environment in a different way. And so starting to look for those kinds of opportunities. So now I know what I'm looking for. It's
Mhm.
like, okay, at home we used to live like in extended families, right? And there was always something happening because when you live as a big commune, like there's always something happening, going on around. But now you're out of that. It's okay. So you have to make it's like you have to make your own happening, right? And so
Mhm.
we have to uh, create these new opportunities or find a way to make them big deals. Like, so we started like almost like little rituals of sorts. Like, okay, we have like a movie night whereby we get some takeout and sit together as a family and watch a movie together. And we always do it consistently on this day. So it's part of our tradition now, right? It's like
Okay.
then we,
Even though it didn't look like it looked in Uganda, you were making a direct connection. This is continuous with what we used to do back home
yeah,
here in our
yeah,
new
like,
home. Yeah.
yes, yes.
Okay.
In the new home, we sort of like had to start cultivating these new traditions of sorts. Like, oh, okay, what, and in the process, I also found like I had to get to know the family members more. It's like, okay, it's not just they are not just a child. They're a person who has certain needs and they show up a certain way. Uh, Sometimes you want to kind of like thought that like and manage it. It's like, oh, you're just a child. You should just do this. But actually, they're not just a child. They're also an individual who's self-expressing. We need to kind of like accommodate that as well and find a way to make the whole thing flow. And so trying to find out like what everybody wanted to eat, right? Like what do you like to eat? Why do you like to eat that? Because we had this problem of a lot of waste. Like
Mm.
back home in Uganda, you the one of the traditions you'd say is there's certain sayings about this. Like you just eat the food that's there, like what's made. Like there's a big reasoning behind it and there's a whole understanding of it. But like if I came to visit you, Seth, at your house and you made a meal, I would not I wouldn't say that I don't eat that. I'll just eat it. Like this whole idea of dietary preferences is for us like is a very Western thing. Like, oh, you can choose, you can say no. That can be very rude. You don't want to be
Right.
rude. You have to be polite by just accepting.
Yeah.
And so yeah, and so kind of like learning that. It's like, but what are our real dietary preferences? What, does so and so like to eat? What does so and so not like to eat?
Hmm.
And how do we optimize like our, let's say, grocery shopping to accommodate for that? How do we optimize how we make meals to accommodate for everyone, such that we're
So
not,
when you were doing
yeah.
these gatherings, like it's like a movie night, but this was more than your family. You were inviting others and getting together, or
No, it was just with the family because I was
okay.
just experimenting with with
But
the
it sounds
family to
like
go
you're
like,
treating maybe your children as partly children growing up in the Australian culture who are drawn to also the sort of individual preferences that maybe they're being offered through school or whatnot.
yeah,
Um, but I also imagine if, your son says, "Why do we do this?" You could explain it by making the connection to Uganda. In other words, there could be something that's being transferred here.
yes, yeah, totally. That was all part of it. Like I needed to be able to explain to him why certain things are being done a certain way because at first I couldn't explain that. And uh growing up, none of this was explained to me. I was always just told that's how it's always been. You just do that. And
Yeah.
so now I wanted to be in a position where I could explain why.
Hmm.
And so I felt like, okay, if I'm going to be able to explain this, I need to understand the inner workings and where it's coming from and why it's designed the way it's designed. Uh, and in the process, I found I had to redesign
Hmm.
most of these
Hmm.
things, which was a great pleasure. And I'm still on that journey, like still, expanding out that menu of things that I'm designing for the family, but also learning as I go, making adjustments and tweaks. So it's a it's a fun experience.
Uh-huh. So it sounds like with John Vervaeke's idea of domicide, like as I understand it, it's like losing home. You no longer have a home. You're homeless in the world. Um, but that was one of your first responses in terms of creating a practice of building a feeling of home, even though it's a new, because you're needing to navigate between the two cultures. You started creating a sense of home for yourself, for your family. What were some of the other practices that you began to include and develop?
Oh, so things like a bedtime routine, but that was in alignment with let's say what we knew, right? So we had this problem. So we don't like we like routinizing children is considered a strange thing, like where I come from, because like, what do you mean routinize the child? You just tell them and they do it, right? That's what somebody would say. And I was like, yeah, but what if they don't want to do it? Then they be naughty and then they fight back, and then you guys get into this unnecessary fight. And I don't know if that's loving at all, right? And so it's like, how do we actually make it a loving situation? Because like you're in a home, these are your loved ones. Should you not engage in a loving way? And I make this joke even here at home. It's uh, like we have to practice kindness to one another. And if we don't, if it's kind of like we have to keep cultivating the spirit of kindness, right? And if the reason for that, my reasoning is like if we don't cultivate the spirit of kindness, or if we break the spirit of kindness, then that will make things not good, which will kind of like end up corrupting the love, and then we shall just end up in a big fight. Uh, by over dramatize it, I say like, look, if you kill the spirit of kindness, then you're directly killing the spirit of love. And if God is love, then you're trying to kill God. You shouldn't try to kill God. Like, don't do that. It's not a good thing.
You bring in a little authority. Respect
Yeah,
the
you get
authority. Yeah, good.
yeah, because
Good.
I could argue for it. Like it's fine.
Uh-huh.
I could make the argument. But I sort of like try to show them like how it links up. Like yeah. You know, it starts off with kindness, but kindness is linked to love, and God is love. Like you know,
Right.
if
But
we
is
did the
it
good things,
kindness? Is it kindness then to tell the child what to do and that they need to do it, or just to play on the other end of it?
yeah. So you mean well, of course, when you're telling them what to do, because
Right.
you're trying to make it clear. But how you do it, how you tell them matters, because it has to be a way in which they get.
Hmm.
Because if you just tell them and they're not getting it, then
Right.
you're probably killing the spirit of kindness.
Right. Right. So there's a way that the parent can kill the spirit of kindness, but there's also a way
Yeah,
that the child can kill the spirit of kindness, and they might be
yeah,
different, but there's
yeah,
this whole relationship, and it includes all the way to God. Yeah.
yeah. And us playing together nicely is part of, being in alignment of, try not to kill God.
Yeah.
Like,
Well,
let's not kill God.
I love that. I mean, I'm really appreciating how in each one of these examples, you're really weaving between kind of two different ways of understanding, two different ways of doing, and finding your own way. Um, so I wonder just, I mean, I don't know exactly where we've arrived in terms of like chronology, what year it is, but eventually when you begin to have your own podcast and you're writing, I mean, was it that you had many experiences with your own family, and then at a certain point you began to understand that maybe some of what you discovered could be helpful to others. Like, how did that happen, and when did that kind of begin to unfold?
Yeah, so part of the things that help with that, I took this course by Taylor Barrett. I think he's put it now on the what is it called? Awaken to Meaning platform, the one from Baveki Foundation. Like in the very early days, the dialectic into, he called it the dialogue
Uh,
OS,
the
the kernel.
dialectic into dialogos.
Yeah, the
That's
dialectic into dialogos,
the
yeah.
practice of discussing the virtues in different, like honesty or bravery or these kinds of things. So I took that course too. I think they had a couple sections, so I don't think we were together in that. But so, okay, that was kind of a
Yeah,
launching pad for you.
yeah, that was a launching pad for me. Like it gave me the courage to actually do something. Like I came to discover that I did have like something to say
Yeah,
around uh, that space, but also I discovered that all these little experiments I was doing in trying to undomicile myself, right?
right, right.
Yeah, by reconstructing my own in a way that I was in agreement with, recultivating that sense of having home again. I was like, oh, there are all these little discoveries I've made. I think that may be helpful for someone who's going through a similar experience. Because like I felt like going through that, like I didn't like when I spoke about it, like if some people would resonate with it, but rarely would I find someone who was going through something similar, right? Like most of the time it was probably just me. It was like even I still know some friends who are probably going through a similar thing, like from what they voice and what the concerns they raise, but they haven't come to see it in this way as well. And so I felt like, okay, maybe I can just capture some of these, and who knows, maybe it will help someone someday. And and that's how the whole idea of the blog was born. Because like I would sit down and write down these thought out things like that I've learned. It's like, oh, I was doing this and I learned this, and here's the progression, and capture it there. So I did a few of those, but then I was like, wait, it sounds it would be more interesting. Like it would take a long time to write one of those, right? Like write it, rewrite it, edit it. I want to write it faster. Like I wonder if I tapped into, following the tradition of dialectic into dialogue. Say, if I dialogued with someone about it, would it not tease out something that was even that I couldn't just get access to just from my own experiences and just from my own mind? And so I started to invite like friends and anyone who was available to chat. And it's like, hey, come on, let's just have a chat, a recorded conversation, and see where it goes. And
Mhm.
then I'd go off and edit that. And as I edited it, because like it would just be a conversation, like it wasn't like structured or anything. There were no real prepared questions. We just dive into it and go. And then later, after I've edited it, I would get the sense of it, like the theme that was coming up, like it would inspire me to write something. And so you'd have this conversation and what it inspired me how to write, and then the two would, it's kind of like they're related but not the same in a way. And so I started to do these publications, and yeah, it's been going. I think it's slowed down now a little bit, but yeah, I still do it. It's fun.
So it's like you're developing ideas, but you think, oh, the simplest thing is just to give me a dialogue partner, and that reflection, that exchange is going to, it's like you had a confidence that that's just a generative thing to do. So you have your ideas that are ready, but you just assume almost that they can expand by bringing them into dialogue in this way. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And also through dialogue, it really helps uh situate them. And something that's not really said a lot about the power of this kind of dialogue, uh what I find amusing and so beautiful about it is like you are holding a space for something new to emerge.
Right.
And so it's kind of like even what we're doing now, right? It's like we're sort of like mutually exploring the
Mhm.
same it could be experience on my side, on your side, but we're mutually doing it. Like we're going to it as a team. We're on the same side, right? In in
Right.
in normal discourse, I don't know why people feel like they have to come at it at opposite ends, like
Right.
challenge each other and sort of like uh, be a bit more provocative and surveil each other in some sense. And like I see the necessity for that sometimes, but I feel like it's less than like it's not it doesn't allow for the whole context to unfold. And so
Right.
this is very prevalent like in the culture I have back home in Uganda. It's like how do we so that's where I get started. Like how do we teach dialectic into dialogos to a group that is like this? Like a different kind of way of life. It's like trust is a challenge, which feeds into like communication and brings everything to interaction to be very combative. It's like
Right. Right.
dialectic into dialogos could solve this,
Mm.
but how do you introduce it to a group that is where it's going to be hostile? They're not going to want to receive it, and they may uh, not have the space to entertain it. It's like
Mhm.
how do you make it accessible to a group like that? And so this becomes like a very interesting dilemma or challenge to kind of like think about for me. And I'm still wondering about that. If you have any ideas.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, just like in terms of what you said about what is this kind of dialogue and even what is the dialogue we're having right now. I mean, obviously, I could just as you tell me about your experience, I could notice everything that's different than my experience. And I mean, it's useful to compare notes, but I could also, I could tell you my point of view and how it's better, right? Or something like
Yeah.
that. And we're not doing that here, but as you point out, that really becomes, like home or love or the proper way to eat or gender identity. Like these are all things that we could decide that I know the right way. And obviously, if you're different, then you've got it the wrong way. And it changes the entire, yeah, it changes the entire quality of the interchange. And there's a lot of history of like, in school, my daughter, this is a common thing in the West. I don't know if this is part of the experience in Uganda, but like they have debate teams in the schools, right? Like, and it's like, we're practicing, I mean, maybe this is something a young person does because they want to become a lawyer. And what does a lawyer do? They win arguments. That's their job is to win the argument. Um, but like referring to John Vervaeke you brought up, this is one of the distinctions he makes a lot is like is the conversation antagonistic or is it cooperative? Um, and so you're imagining bringing this kind of cooperative style of dialogue to Uganda? Like, do you imagine traveling home, actually maybe potentially leading some kind of event and starting to do that? And then, but it sounds like you're also anticipating this may or may not be received well. What are the questions? I mean, I'll try to contribute ideas since you asked, but what are the sort of I don't know what are the challenges here? And on the other side, what do you hope that would do um, to bring these practices?
Yeah, like I hope because these practices sort of one, I guess one known result of them is a deeper sense of connectedness, right?
Hmm.
It brings you to a place whereby you see how much more similar you are than how different you are, right? And usually, one thing that drives conflict is the difference. It's like, like you're saying before, like, oh, I know this better, oh, I have a different perspective, and mine is better. They need to win. That need to kind of like win, and in our culture, we have a lot of that, and it's not by accident. Like it's coming from a real place. Like it's there's a need to survive. Uh, it's a very like Uganda is a small country with a huge population, like over 45 million people in about 200,000 square kilometers, right? So there's a there's a lot of people and less resources, and because of that, um, some situations are just you just gotta try and win the situation. Otherwise, you're not gonna make it, right? And
Right.
so that's very valid. Um, However, through looking at it like a dialectic into dialogos lens, you could argue that, oh, but we could all win together, right? We could all win together and help each other win, right? But that's a very strange kind of like and this would definitely fall under field in Christ because you guys do really well with bringing things that are so strange together, right? And so like I feel like it's right up your alley because this would feel so different. Because imagine like you have a competitive scenario, let's say at the Olympics, and you're saying we can all win together. It's like, what do you mean we can all win together? There's only three medals, three spots at the top. And what do you mean? Like there can only be three people, and even between those three, we have one who made it to the highest, and then the next, and then the third. That is the model in which we see the world, and for us back home, that motto is prevalent through everything. It's like everybody's just trying to win. Uh, you have a discussion with someone and you offer them a suggestion, and one question that comes up that an underlying thing is that the best? Is that the best that I can get?
Mm.
Because I want the best, right? And like best is relative. Like you could argue about,
Mm.
best for who, best for what, in which scenario, but we don't go into that nuance. We just want the best, right? And so, as a way of combating that, I personally feel that a dialectic into dialogous approach, whereby we're sort of like collaboratively exploring things and trying to help each other win and win together can be a great framework to, unite the society, bring people together because we have a lot of divisions. There's about 56 different tribes in the country. So just from that alone, there's a huge difference. But also, when you look at the history, from colonialism and that did not help. It's like we have to like growing up we have to learn how to speak English partly so we can communicate among the different 56 tribes. It's like, okay, we have this common language we can use, but also partly as a gateway to connect to the rest of the world. But in the process of doing that you're losing your mother tongue because then it's like now like I may be able to understand certain concepts much better in English, but I wouldn't be able to translate them.
Mm.
It would take me a really long time, and I probably need to even consult some linguist experts who are experts in my mother tongue to help
Mhm.
me find the correct words to map certain words to. Like we don't have uh, for lack of a better way, we don't have this experience and we can't language it in
Mm.
that sense. And some of these ideas, these Western concepts, they're great concepts. They're very beautiful, but we don't have them in our languages. And so if we can't language them, like, we were saying in that course, we're taught, name it to tame it is a real thing. If you can't name a thing, then you very
Right.
much, it's going to be
Right.
very difficult to bring it into your reality. And so we don't have names for many of these things.
Mm.
And so it's like, well, I'd have to create names for some of these concepts. And it's a daunting, it's a cool task. I would love to.
Yeah.
uh, but it comes with a huge responsibility.
Right. Well, I mean, I think even in the West, for someone, I mean, I've often sort of joked with friends about people like yourself who have watched John Vervaeke's series. Not everyone is going to watch 50 hours of discussion, but there's still concepts in there that I think are useful for anyone. And so this is often a question I ask is like, how can I discuss something that he might have spent 3 episodes to develop the idea and using all of this history. Um, but again, not so much to talk about John Vervaeke's work, but I'm curious if well, two things come to mind. So have you been sharing any of these ideas or practices with other Ugandans in Australia? And I wondered, like, what was the most recent time you were back in Uganda? Was this, have you been in Uganda since beginning to work with these practices? In other words, have you tested some of these ideas that might not uh, I don't know what was there's many tribes. There's also many languages in Uganda. Is that correct? So I don't know if there's a particular Ugandan language that you would be trying to put the concepts into. But in any case, this idea of because we're all humans, we're all having a human experience. So the assumption would be that any concept from another human being or any practice from another human being is potentially beneficial. And that's kind of the translation you're trying to make. But I'm wondering, with those two groups, Ugandans in Australia and traveling back home, if you've experimented there at all.
I have experimented a little bit with, let's say, the Ugandans here in Australia. Um, Partly part of the podcast is to do that. Like I invite these friends of mine to have a conversation, and we do usually have a conversation. Like on some of the, if you happen to watch some of the episodes, um, you may get a sense of what I'm talking about. Like you can't not help start it in a very how can I say, provocative way, right? Like I'll send you a couple like after this, and you can assess for yourself. But it's the provocation is just part of like our cultures. Like this is how we sort of like tease each other and get a bit playful. And so doing that was for me like how can I start a conversation at that place and then bring it in a place whereby we're sort of like mutually following the same direction and we're on the same page and doing it together. And
Mhm.
sort of I've tested that like, with a few people, and that always goes beautifully. Um, and I guess like part of the thing that makes it that holds a good container is like, oh, this is a recorded conversation. It's like, okay, uh, that can make people want to behave because they know they want to be perceived in a certain light, right?
Right.
Um, but I find it the same, like in even outside of like a recording, and we're just outside talking. Like I have many people now with whom we can just sit down and just talk. So now I'll do these things where I'll reach out to someone. It's like, hey, can we just meet up for a coffee? And we just go sit down and just have a nice, beautiful chat for like a couple of hours.
Hmm.
Instead of like a 10-minute, hi, how are you doing? What's the weather? And I'll see you next time. And
Right.
now we actually just talk about life and what we're dealing with and just sort of like explore together. And so that that I've been able to do with the people in here in Australia, I haven't like the last chance I got to go to Uganda was about 2 years ago in 2022. So by then I didn't say like I didn't even I was only there for a couple of weeks, so I didn't get a lot of opportunity to do that.
Hmm.
But I will be getting a chance to go again, and so I will be very intentional to kind of like see how it plays out this time, but also trying to seek for like local partners with whom to kind of like do this because like for it's so amazing though. Like in that course, like for a few weeks, we were going back and forth and learning all these conversational techniques. How to notice, how to mirror, how to think and feel at the same time, and how to discern in those areas. And like it was great, being speaking in a meditative way. It's like all these things like as I saw it build up, and then later on, it's like, okay, now let's bring it all together in a conversation. I was like, that is pretty cool. So it's like I kind of like feel like, oh, so if we reconstruct it in this way, then we can start teaching these techniques. Like, great, but what metaphor would I use to explain this concept to this
Right.
person who has no idea about this stuff? How
Hmm.
do I language that for them such that they can get it? And I think if they are before me, like if the person is right before me, I can't be able to test like a few things. Go like, okay, maybe how about we try this? How about we try that? And eventually we could find something that works. I guess like I need like a like an understudy like of
But so
sorts to experiment with.
when you're talking with friends and you set aside a couple of hours to have this more open-ended exploratory conversation, um, what you just said, make sure I understood, but are you saying that there are actually some techniques of conversation which you would explicitly explain to the person you're with and test them out and get, I mean, you took a course, right? So you have some of these techniques for yourself, they're embodied, but have you already begun to share, hey, as we're talking, here's the thing we can try, or we can try this, or is it just more a sense of opening a conversation that might be a new kind of conversation for the person you're with, but maybe you're not so explicitly saying that. You're just maybe you're showing up differently than they might be used to.
Yeah. So
Mm.
I show up differently and I'm sort of like curating the conversation but through how I'm showing up
Yeah.
and sort of like as we know like it only takes one side of one person to hold the space for it to kind of like open up and flourish. So I
Mhm.
do that, and so uh, it's great from that perspective because I find like when I try to explain what I'm doing, it, that's when it all breaks down because it doesn't make sense. It's
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
yeah, okay, so now that's the next barrier. It's like, how do I show someone else what I'm doing
Mhm.
during the conversation
Right.
so that they too can do it mutually and then we can sort of like now start to do it for each other because right now like I do it
Mhm.
but I don't think it's like you sort of like have to do a huge investment at the beginning, like you have to do a lot of like space holding and kind of like shaping it up to a point when like the logos picks up, and once
Mhm.
the logos picks up, it happens. Like they resonate, they respond in a way, and it takes off, right?
Mhm.
But I kind of like have to do the initial wrangling up of the logos so that it kind of like builds up, and so
Right.
I'm going like, okay, how do I teach them to wrangle up the logos as well
Mm.
without having take them through a 26-hour training.
Yeah, that's right. Again, again, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this is a really And I mean, there's a million examples you could find, but like we can be deeply transformed through a learning process that we go through as an individual. Um, and we might do that because we just happen to be lucky enough to be in the right place in the right circumstance to have a certain experience, or we might have the resources to invest time and money to learn a certain thing. But then how do we translate that? How do we, share that beyond ourselves? And we can't require everyone we meet to go through the process that we ourselves went through. And that seems to be, just built into the whole question that you're asking about, because really, like, so we've spent some time now talking about that practice, the dialectic into dialogos. I think we've only described it very in a vague way, but I mean, hopefully listeners can hear it. It's a very intentional way of having a conversation. Um, and even though we haven't been discussing it since we've both been doing it, I'm kind of feeling some of those aspects here. But yeah, it's really like we could say being very aware of not just that we're talking and there's a subject, but like, what does this feel like? And so I'm tracking how it feels as I go. So I'm trying to understand you, but I'm also noticing the quality of the conversation. And I'm kind of internally asking myself, how is the way I'm showing up in this conversation actually creating that quality? And, if there's a quality I like, well, how can I deepen that quality? Or if there's something coming in that feels like it's, obstructing the conversation, well, what can I do to minimize that obstruction? So there's something like a flow between us that we can be intentional about. So that's dialectic into dialogos, but as I listen to you, like I'm still including, your experiences of arriving and, from savory and sweet food or how you have a movie night with your family and it's kind of connecting two cultures. Um, I mean, I'm guessing that there's sort of something larger, even though there's that particular practice you'd like to bring to Uganda. It seems like the overall sweep of what you've learned, is something that you're wanting to share. And just, as I listen to you, obviously, from the United States, I've traveled and that has been always illuminating for me. But we're increasingly in a, I mean, we've been a connected world for a long time, and then the connections and are only deepening. And what happens one part of the globe, it affects the other part of the globe even faster than it did in the past. Um, so I feel like what you're talking about, is more generally important for anyone. Anyone, for example, who's watching the conversation. Um, but just in terms of our time, we're sort of near the end, but it might be fun just sort of at the end to get a sense of like, yeah, when you look at the world, when you look at the whole thing, when you look at the state of things today, some of the challenges that are really posed to humanity as a whole. Um, yeah, just I don't know how to ask it, but how do you situate what you're doing in terms of because when you come like when I meet with you at the net, um, you know, the conversation could be about anything. It could touch any part of the globe. It could, the whole history of philosophy is often there because there's a lot of very well-read people who join those conversations. Anyway, I'm opening a big door here, but just before we end, I kind of like to get your sense of yeah, just how you think of your work in the world today, in this moment that we're living through. And anything else you wanna add.
Now, I kind of feel like we are what we use to live like what life like before has dramatically shifted with all these the times we're in, the recent COVID thing and now the tech advancements and the rise of the chatbots, all of that. So it's a very interesting time to be alive. But I also feel like the whole idea of um, the community, right? Like the global community is shifting. and we're really really becoming like a big one big village as a as humanity living on this planet. And so now what used to be like my little problems down in, my neighborhood here under the mango tree place, uh, is not the only problem that, I'm dealing with or having to deal with. Like, Elon Musk makes a salute at the inauguration. Now I know about it and I have to think about how do I have to explain this to my child? Like, no, no, we don't do that or something like that, right? And so, sort of like having to respond to world events, even that are way beyond out of your sphere of practicing your life. Uh, yeah, I feel like what we really need is to pay attention to how we are participating. Like, and I feel, in Vaveki's work, he has that golden, four P's, the four ways of knowing, four ways of four ways of knowing, which is the proposition of knowing, procedure knowing, perspectival knowing, and participatory knowing. And he presents them in that order, but I kind of feel like it has to be like the way life works, it's flipped on the other side. Like life always begins in participation, and then slowly that's when we build up the perspective, and then now we try to understand what we're doing, and then we codify that into like the facts and which facts we might be going against. So it's we sort of like leave it backwards.
Mm.
And once I feel like once you've seen that that's what's happening, so it's really, really important to pay attention to how we're participating because uh, this is it's like the strongest way of knowing. This is how we really associate in life and with our surroundings and what's going on. And by paying attention to that, we can sort of like influence the rest of it, right? Like by fine tuning how we are participating. And so it's really, really important to know what it is you're doing and how you're doing. Like the famous psychologist will tell you, oh, you can say whatever you believe, but if I watch you long enough, like I'll tell you exactly what you believe because of how you behave, right? And so we're already living out certain beliefs and certain ways of life that we may not even be aware of.
Mhm.
And I feel like it's time to, you know, become more aware of that, like point more attention to that and say, look, uh, we could end up fighting in the sphere of language and, our different languages of experience as we battle and we compare and try to see what's better. It's like, oh, I say it this way and spend a lot of time unpacking that. Uh, yeah, that's helpful. But even more important, it's like our own language of being, playing on your musicality of being. We have to kind of like sense into what that language is. And I guess like if it's to play with the musicality of being, if it's like a theory of music of being, right? We also have our own theory of who we are and how we engage things. And so we have to curate that practice. We have to curate our day to day, what we're doing, what we're engaging in, how we're showing up, and uh, whether we know it or we don't, it's we can really do a lot of fine tuning it and adjusting it to be more in flow with ourselves. And once we are flowing with ourselves, then it's much easier to flow with things around us. I like to say this of thing about trying to live the perfect day. It's
Mm.
like you may not be able to live a perfect life, but you surely can try and have like a good day, right? And doesn't take much. It's just being a bit more intentional and just following through with your intention for that day, and then try again the next day and try again. One day at a time. And if you can, I make this projection of like if you can manage to get about 60% of your day to be aligned with your intention, uh, that should be good enough for you to be living life in flow with what you really want it to flow with. And so that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love how practical it is. If I could just live every day at least 60% in alignment with my intentions. And I also just really appreciate how um, you highlighted participation. So whatever my ideas are, as you said, the psychologist who spends enough time with me, they're gonna see how I enact myself in the world, and but that we can begin there. So maybe even my ideas aren't clear, but how I show up, how I interact with others, how I, you know, do things like eat and be with my family. Those are all moments where I can practice in this, as I'm understanding it, maybe what you would call the lived quality of my life. So beautiful, beautiful stuff. Yeah, well, I feel like there's a lot more we could get to, but I'm really glad we took the time to really kind of arrive to this moment by getting your background. That really helped me to situate what you're doing on the blog and with your podcast. And potentially we could do this again and maybe kind of pick up where we left off because I can definitely think of more questions. Um, but before we go, any last things that you wanted to say, or any information about your work that you'd like people to know about, and we can also include that below the video. But yeah, any last thoughts?
Yeah, well, last thoughts would be we're trying to, as part of that endeavor of bringing some of the things closer to the people, we're going to be embarking on a project with a friend of mine, Mayase, uh, whereby we sort of like build a space where we can just expound on proverbs, right? Like, we did a little mini series on the Live Quality podcast where we took she wrote a book um, about using immigrant life stories called Muchalo, and she took Bemba proverbs. She's Bemba from Zambia, and these are proverbs that were taught to her by her grandma, and she wrote a book about it. And so we spent a lot of time sort of like taking that proverb and sort of like just doing a dialectic into dialogos with it, sort of like unpacking it a little bit in the shortest way we could, and that was really fun to play with that. And so we thought we should expound on that. So there'll be probably maybe we may do it on the same channel or create a different one for it where we feel like there's a whole resonance around that. And
Mhm.
it's also part of the traditions, especially like in many African cultures. Uh, Wisdom was passed on through proverbs and sayings and folk tales. And so we kind of feel like we could start there and sort of like tap into that and see how we can now start, you know, teasing out virtues and things like that and bringing them closer to the people in a way that they may be used to and see how that goes. So that would be a big project coming up for me. But other than that, uh, do check out livedquality.com. I post blogs there, and we also have a YouTube channel, and also on the podcasting streaming services where we host those conversations, and you can get to learn a little bit of strange wisdom from a person you've never met.
I love that. Yeah, so we can include those links, and if you want to give me a specific link for that discussion on the proverb that sort of kicked off this project, maybe we could include that as well. So this was awesome, Clayton. I'm so glad we were able to do this today, and thank you for your time, and let's do it again.
Yeah, thanks, Seth.
All right.